name is Matt from Ace Appliance in Toledo, Ohio. Welcome back to another in-home diagnostic video from ApplianceVideo.com. Today we're going to be replacing a 2-ton condensing unit, air conditioning condensing unit. And before we get started, we're going to check on a couple things around our environment. First of all, before you start replacing the unit, you want to make sure that there's not any poison ivy around. You want to make sure that a lot of times you'll see bees nests. Sometimes when you take off your cover inside your disconnect, you've got to be very careful. A lot of bees like to make nests inside the 220 volt disconnects and underneath the covers. So I normally check the environment, make sure that there's not any bees around, make sure there's no poison ivy around. The first thing that I normally will do is, regardless of the situation, is shut the power off. This particular disconnect, it slides down and then it opens up. Every unit, if it's coded properly, has to have a disconnect within 6 feet of where the condensing unit is placed. So this particular one is code. It has to have a 220 volt disconnect. This particular one just pulls straight out. And on this particular disconnect, you have two 30 amp fuses which will pull out. On these fuses, they actually have expanders. Most of the fuse disconnects just have the small bar, but since this one has the large bar, they actually put expanders on each side of the fuse to expand to fit it inside the actual bar because it's a large bar. In most states, you need a contractor's license to install one of these condensing units because you have to reclaim the refrigerant and you have to be certified in reclaiming and recharging and handling of a hazardous material. Every state is different. Sometimes you can pull a homeowner's permit if you are not licensed in certain states and you're able to install the unit without having a permit. So state by state it's completely different. We're going to get started by now. We've got the 240 volt breaker pulled out of the disconnect box. Now I always, once the disconnect is pulled, that's telling us that we should not have 240 volts coming through this wire down to the condensing unit. That's not always the case. Inside this box is a connection of the 240 volts. Certain technicians will find a bad fuse or a bad disconnect bar. And what they do is they take a shortcut. Instead of replacing the disconnect bar or the disconnect, they will bypass the disconnect and they will actually have voltage going to the unit all the time. So even though your disconnect is pulled, you always want to check voltage once you take the cover off before you start unwiring the unit. I've 3 different times in the last 25 years have found that I pulled the disconnect bar and still had 220 volts down to the unit because once I took this cover off, I found out that somebody at one time or another just bypassed the 2 fuses, and therefore if I wouldn't have checked, I might not be here today doing this video. Okay, currently right now, to get started before we do anything, now that the 220 volt disconnect is pulled, we have no power to the unit hopefully. We're going to start by reclaiming the refrigerant that's currently in the unit. By doing so, you've got a suction line, which is your large line, and you've got a liquid line, which is your small line. The suction line, the largest line, always goes to your blue hose, which is the low side of the system. The high side of the system, which is your red hose, will always go to the liquid line, which is the small line on the condensing unit. Currently, right now, we have 2 hoses hooked up right to the gauges. We have one hose hooked up to the suction line, which the refrigerant is going to come from the condensing unit, go through the suction line, come through the suction line. Once we open up the port, it's going to come out, it's going to get sucked out through the yellow hose to our reclaimer, which is right over to the right of us. Now that we have the reclaimer hooked up, we've got from our gauges coming through the yellow hose, it's going to be going through our suction purge line. It's going to be coming out our discharge line and going into the tank. So we've got the tank opened up now. We've got the unit set to purge. And what we're going to do is we're going to take and turn this unit on. Once we do, it's going to start reclaiming the 2 to 4 pounds of refrigerant that's currently in the system. Now we're going to currently turn on the reclaiming machine, and we're going to take and have it on purge. We'll turn it on, we'll reclaim the refrigerant that's currently in the system, which normally takes anywhere from 7 minutes to 15 minutes depending upon how much refrigerant's in the system and what the temperature is outside, because refrigerant expands with heat. Okay, the next thing we're going to do is take our electrical panel off the unit. So we'll take the 6 screws that are on the panel off, and we are then going to check for power, because even though the 220 volt disconnect is pulled, that doesn't mean we don't have feedback voltage coming into the unit, and or possibly somebody that didn't bypass this 220 volt breaker at one time. Now we'll be pulling off the panel to the unit. Be very careful, because even though the disconnect is pulled, like I said, there's possibly still voltage there. You also have capacitors that are in the unit. As you can see, there's a lot of spider webs. There's a run capacitor here. This run capacitor always holds a charge, regardless if the unit is running, if it has voltage to it or not. So the next thing that we're going to do before we even touch any of the electrical wiring is we're going to short out the run capacitor and discharge the capacitor. Now what we're going to do with an insulated screwdriver with a plastic head, we're going to take and discharge the capacitor before we remove any wiring, because the capacitors can hold up to 200 to 250 volts when fully charged, and they can discharge a high voltage to you. So we're taking across the 2 terminals, we're going to short those out. Sometimes you see a little spark coming from there, and that's going to tell you that the capacitor is discharged. There's 2 wires. There's a blue and white wire coming from our 240 volt disconnect from inside the house, and we should have 240 volts here when properly charged. But now that we have our disconnect bar pulled, you should have 115 volts to each line coming into the unit. So what I'm doing now is I have my voltage checker, and I'm going to check each one of these lines to see if I have any voltage. There's no voltage coming into this line. If it would be a red light that would come on. And on the other side, there would be a red light that comes on. So we know that there's no voltage there. And to even check it as a triple check, you can push in the disconnect, the 220 volt disconnect here. There's a little pin that you can push in. If you push that in and there was voltage going to these 2 wires, the unit would start up. So we know the unit is completely dead and we're safe. Capacitor discharged. We can start touching the unit now. Okay, now we're going to take the blue suction line hose off the suction line, so we can, now that the unit is completely reclaimed, so that's going to come off. And we're going to take and now cut the liquid line and the suction line and unwire the unit now, so we can install the new unit.
Well, what you're going to do is you're going to go ahead and remove the insulation from the line, so you're able to then cut the copper tube underneath.
Right. Now we're going to take and scrape the actual insulation that's on the suction line right now. It's taped on there. So we're going to scrape off the insul tube, they call it, but this particular insul tube that they put on was actually had a adhesive backing. So we're scraping that off so we can get a good surface to make a clean cut on the suction line. Now we've got a tubing cutter, and we're going to go ahead and put the tubing cutter on there. We're going to ratchet off the suction line and cut the suction line so we can disconnect the refrigerant lines. Okay, I just finished cutting the line. Now we have the suction line with a clean cut, and we're going to ratchet now the liquid line right here in about the same location. So we'll get that ratcheted. You've got to open the ratchet to the open position, and we'll clamp it onto the liquid line, and we'll cut the liquid line now. Okay, we're going to finish cutting the liquid line now, it's just cut now. We've got a clean cut there. So we've got the suction line cut, the liquid line cut. The next two steps are to take and unwire our 24 volts low voltage going into the contactor, and then we're going to unwire the 220 volt disconnect whip, which is right here. Now we're going to disconnect the low voltage wiring, 24 volts coming into the unit, and the 220 volt wiring going into the contactor, and remove the whip and the low voltage to completely disconnect the unit. Now we have to disconnect the 220 volt disconnect whip. What we have to do, there's a little screw tab on the back side of it which is rusted on, so we're going to take a hammer, we're going to tap it counterclockwise, and we hope that we can loosen it up enough to unscrew it by hand, which we are right now. Once we get it loose, there's not a lot of rust on there, we can unscrew that. Now that that's unscrewed, the back side, as you can see, it's threaded. The nut is on the inside. Now we're going to take and unscrew the two screw heads right here, which hold the two 240 volt wires on. So that's one side of the 240 volt circuit, the blue wire. Now we're going to screw the white side to the 240 volt contactor. We're going to unscrew that and that. We're going to slide this through. When we do, very, very important to check and make sure that you do not lose this nut, because if you do, you have to go buy a whole new whip. So what I always do is I take the nut, I put it back on, and I screw it a couple times so we know where it's at when we go to reconnect it. Now we're going to go ahead and disconnect the low voltage wiring. Always inspect your low voltage wire up to the house. Make sure that it's not ripped. A lot of times mice will want to eat it. Chipmunks will want to eat through this. So you inspect it all the way up to the house. Follow it all the way into the unit. Unwire your 240 volts, your 24 volts to the contactor. Before you do that, you always want to make sure that your indoor thermostat's in the off position, because if you don't, if you short out these two wires, it will blow your transformer inside the house. So we know, I've already checked voltage, there's no 24 volts here. We know that the thermostat's off, so we're going to unwire both of these wires. We'll pull the two wires through. Now we have our high voltage 240 volts, we have our low voltage 24 volts disconnected, we have our suction line disconnected, our liquid line disconnected. It's time to remove the unit now. Now we're going to remove the unit, get the old unit out of the way so we can put the pad down for the new unit. Thank you for watching another quality video from ApplianceVideo.com.